In the autumn of 1887, on a wind-scoured point of the Oregon coast, where the Coquille River poured its brown freight into the Pacific, a young woman stood in a cold iron room at the top of a lighthouse and understood that something behind the wall was wrong. The room was small and round, hardly more than 9 feet across, and it should have held nothing but the great lamp and its brass machinery and the smell of whale oil and salt. It held those things. It also held a smell that had no business being there, a low, sweetish rot that came and went with the draft, and when she pressed her hand to the seaward curve of the plaster, she felt that the wall gave back a sound it should not have given, a hollow knock under her knuckles where there ought to have been only stone and the sea beyond it. Her name was Tessa Vane, and she had come to this point with $11, a canvas roll of her father's tools, and a letter that said the keeper's post was hers if she could prove she could keep a light. She was 28 years old. She had buried her father in the spring and learned within a month that grief does not pay a landlord, and she had taken the only work that asked for the only thing she truly owned, which was the knowledge of how a lamp is trimmed and fed and made to throw its beam 30 miles out across black water. That knowledge had a price the harbor men did not see when they laughed at the notion of a woman keeper. The price had been paid over 14 years at her father's elbow, and she meant to collect on it now. Stay with me, because the thing behind that wall had been sealed for a long time, and the men who sealed it had counted on no one ever pressing a hand to the plaster and listening. The lighthouse was called the Cheap Lighthouse, and it had earned the name. Up and down the coast, the great towers were built of dressed stone and cost the government tens of thousands of dollars, and their keepers drew steady wages and lived in trim white houses with gardens behind them. This one was different. It had been thrown up in a hurry by a contractor named Halloran 15 years before, a squat brick stock barely 50 feet to the gallery, set on a point that the engineers had said would do well enough for a harbor light if not for a coast light. The harbor men called it the Cheap Lighthouse because everything about it had been done at the lowest possible cost, and they said it with the particular contempt that frontier people kept for things made to fail. Tessa had heard the name within an hour of stepping off the supply schooner. The man who rowed her ashore had jerked his chin at the brick tower on the point and said the Cheap Lighthouse had eaten 3 keepers in 15 years, and none of them had lasted, and the last one had walked off in the night and left the lamp dark, and the harbor had nearly lost a coasting brig on the bar because of it. He said it the way a man warns a stranger off a horse that bites. She had thanked him and shouldered her canvas roll and walked the half-mile of rutted sand to the door, and she had not let him see that the warning had changed nothing because she had nowhere else to go. The keeper's quarters were 2 rooms at the base of the tower, damp and mean, with a stove that drew badly and a window that looked out on the gray water. The man who handed her the keys was the district lamplighter, a thin, tired official named Benfield, who had ridden up from the Cape Blanco station to install her, and did not trouble to hide that he thought the installation a mistake. He showed her the oil store and the logbook and the great spiral stair, and he told her the rules of the light as if she were a child. And when she trimmed the lamp wick in front of him with 3 quick motions of her father's blade, he stopped talking for a moment and looked at her differently. Then he remembered himself and told her the Cheap Lighthouse was a hard post, and she should not expect to stay. What she expected, she kept to herself. She climbed the stair that first evening as the sun went down into the sea, and she lit the lamp, and she stood in the small iron room at the top while the beam swung out over the water, and she felt the building tremble faintly under the wind, the way a cheap thing trembles. The lamp was good. Whatever else Halloran had stinted on, the lamp itself was a proper second-order Fresnel, a beehive of glass prisms taller than she was, and it threw a clean, strong beam. She tended it through the night, and she watched the dawn come up gray and cold, and she told herself she could keep this light as well as any man living. It was on the third night that she first noticed the smell. She had thought at first it was the oil or the damp, or some dead gull caught in the gallery rail. It came faintest in the still hours past midnight, a sweetish, heavy rot under the clean burn of the lamp, and it seemed to gather near the seaward wall. She searched the gallery and found nothing. The watch-room below gave up nothing either. She went back up and stood in the lamp room and breathed the cold air and could not place it, and at last she wrote in the log only that the night had passed without incident, because a keeper who wrote of strange smells would not be a keeper long. Her father had taught her to trust her hands before her eyes. He had been a millwright before his knees gave out, and the Lighthouse service took him on, a man who could find the one bad tooth in a great wooden gear by laying his palm flat to the wheel and feeling for the catch. He had no patience for guessing. "Find the thing," he would say, "and then you will know what you are looking at, and not before." She had laughed at him for it when she was young. She did not laugh now. On the fourth night, she took a candle and went over the lamp room wall by wall, and when she came to the seaward curve, she pressed her hand flat against the cool plaster, and she felt the catch. The wall there was wrong. The lamp room was round, and the plaster ran smooth all the way around it. But along the seaward arc, the curve was not the curve the rest of the room described. It bulged inward by perhaps a hand's breadth, so slightly that no eye would catch it, and no one who was not feeling for it would ever know. She rapped her knuckles along the smooth plaster and heard the sound change from the dull report of plaster on brick to a higher hollow knock that ran for about 4 feet and then went dull again. Behind that 4 feet of plaster there was a space, and from that space, when the draft came round, came the smell. This is the question that kept her at the wall until the candle guttered. Why would a man building a lighthouse at the lowest possible cost spend good labor and good plaster to wall off a section of the lamp room, the one room where every inch was needed, and every pound of weight at the top of a cheap tower mattered? A cheap builder hides nothing, because hiding costs money. Halloran had hidden something. She did not yet know what, but she knew the shape of the question, and she knew that the answer was 4 feet of dark behind a false wall, and that it had been there long enough to begin to smell. She did not break the wall that night. A keeper's first duty is the light, and the light could not be left while she chipped at plaster. She tended the lamp through the dark hours, and at dawn she climbed down and slept, and in the afternoon she walked the half-mile into the cluster of buildings at the river mouth that the people there called a town, and she began carefully to ask questions. The town was a chandlery, a saloon, a cluster of fishermen's shacks, and a store that doubled as the post office, and its memory was long. She bought thread she did not need and salt she did, and she let the storekeeper's wife talk, and she learned that the cheap lighthouse had a history, that the harbor men did not put in the warnings they gave to strangers. The storekeeper's wife was a broad, kind woman named Doone who had buried 2 husbands and kept the store through both, and she had the gift of talk that lonely places breed in their women. And she told Tessa more in an hour over the salt barrel than Benfield had told her in a day. She learned that before the lighthouse there had been a wrecking trade on that coast, in the bad years when the bar was unmarked, and ships came to grief on it in the fog, and that the salvage of those wrecks had made 1 or 2 men rich. She learned that the man who had built the lighthouse, Halloran, had been one of those men, and that there were those in the town who had always wondered why a wrecker would spend his own money to build a light that would put an end to wrecking. Mrs. Doone said it low with a glance at the door, that there had been talk in the old days, talked that the wrecks had not all been the work of the fog. Then she folded her lips and would say no more, and she told Tessa that if she wanted the old talk, she would have to go to Marta in the dunes, and that Marta would likely not give it. There was an old woman who knew more. Her name was Marta Ackerlund, and she was past 80, a Swedish fisherman's widow who lived in a shack at the edge of the dunes and mended nets for the boats. The storekeeper's wife said Marta had been on the point in the wrecking years and had buried a husband and a son to that bar, and that she did not speak of it. Tessa went to her anyway. She found the old woman on her doorstep with a net across her knees and a bone needle in her fingers, and she sat down on the step without being asked and helped her clear a snarl in the net, and for a while neither of them spoke. Marta watched her hands. After a time, she said that the girl knew how to work, and that was rare in those who came from away. Tessa said her father had taught her. Marta asked who her father was, and Tessa told her, and Marta nodded slowly and said that a millwright's daughter would have good hands. Then she asked what the girl wanted, because no one climbed the dune to mend nets with an old woman for the pleasure of it. Tessa told her the truth, which was that there was a false wall in the lamp room of the lighthouse, and that it smelled of something dead, and that she meant to know what was behind it. The old woman's needle stopped. Marta said nothing for a long moment. Then she said that in the winter of 1869, before the light was built, a Norwegian bark called the Skiven had come onto the bar in a December fog with a cargo of coined silver and barlud bound for San Francisco, and that she had broken up in the surf in a single night, and that of the 19 souls aboard her, 4 had come ashore alive, and the rest had not. And she said that the silver had never been recovered, not one coin of it, though the wreckers had worked that beach for a month, and that it had been entered in the county record as lost to the sea. Then she looked at Tessa with eyes gone pale with age, and said that the sea did not take coined silver and give back nothing, and that she had always known the silver came ashore, and that she had never been able to prove where it went. You may have guessed already where this is going. Hold the thought, because the proving of it was harder than the guessing, and a guess that cannot be proved is worth exactly nothing to the people it was stolen from. Tessa walked back to the lighthouse in the last of the light with the old woman's story turning over in her mind, and she lit the lamp, and she stood in the small iron room and looked at the false wall with new eyes. A man who had grown rich on wrecks, a cargo of silver gone from a beach that had been combed for a month, a lighthouse thrown up cheap a few years later on the very point above that bar, built by that same man, with a section of its highest room walled off behind false plaster for no reason a cheap builder would ever have. She did not believe in coincidence. Her father had taught her that coincidence was the name people gave to a pattern they had not yet troubled to trace. Belief was not proof. The wall was not yet open, and the light could not be left. So she set herself a discipline. She would tend the lamp every night without fail because the lives of men on the water depended on it, and because a dark light would bring Benfield up from Cape Blanco with questions she could not afford. And in the afternoons, in the hours she ought to have slept, she would work the wall, an hour or two each day with her father's tools and her own patience, taking the false plaster down so carefully that she could put it back if she had to, and telling no one but the old woman in the dunes what she was about. The work was slow and it was filthy. The false wall had been keyed to the brick with iron nails and a coarse lime plaster, gone hard as stone in 18 years, and she could not simply break it, because breaking it would bring it down in a heap she could never explain and could never restore. She had to take it down in sections, scoring the plaster with a thin chisel along the lines where the nails ran, easing each piece free, numbering it in chalk so she would know where it had stood. Her father had owned 3 chisels, and she had brought all three, the broad one and the narrow one, and the keen little corner chisel. He had ground himself from a worn farrier's rasp, and she learned the wall the way he had taught her to learn a bulky gear, by feel before force, finding where the plaster wanted to part and helping it part there rather than fighting it. A wall, he used to say, will tell you how it was built if you have the patience to ask. This one told her it had been built fast and built scared. The plaster troweled on thick and uneven by a man in a hurry, and that was its own small piece of testimony. Her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles, and she wrapped them in strips of an old flour sack and went on. The dust of the lime got into the cracks and stung, and the cold of the iron room came up through her knees where she knelt, and twice she had to stop and climb down to tend the lamp and come back, and the daylight she worked by was short and going shorter as the autumn closed in. She kept a chalked count of the numbered pieces stacked along the wall, 11 the first afternoon, 19 the second, and the smell grew stronger as the plaster came away. On the third afternoon, she understood that it was not the smell of something newly dead, but of something that had died long ago and been sealed up wet, a smell of old rot and brine, and something underneath it that she could not name. And she sat back on her heels and breathed through her mouth and made herself go on, because a thing only half uncovered is a thing that can still be denied. On the fifth afternoon, a piece of plaster the size of a dinner plate came away in her hands, and she was looking into the dark of the hollow space, and the cold, sealed air of 18 years came out at her, and she lit her candle and held it to the gap. What she saw she did not at first understand. There was a wooden framework built into the space, a kind of cradle of rough timber wedged between the brick and the false wall, and resting in the cradle was the long, pale curve of something that the candlelight could not make sense of. And it was a moment before she understood that she was looking at the prow timber of a ship's boat, a stove-in section of a ship's stern, with the name board still fixed to it, and the letters carved into the name board, gone gray and soft with rot, spelled out a single word. She brought the candle closer with a hand that was not quite steady. The word on the name board was Skiven. She sat back on her heels on the cold iron floor and let the candle burn and made herself think. A wrecker had built a cheap lighthouse and walled into its highest room a piece of the very ship he was said to have salvaged. That was not the act of a man hiding silver. A man hiding silver buries it in the ground where no one will ever connect it to him. This was something stranger, and she did not yet understand it, and her father's voice in her memory told her that she did not yet have the whole thing in her hands, and so she should not yet decide what it was. "Find the thing," he said, "all of it. Then you will know." She worked through the next week with a kind of held breath. She took the false wall down to its full 4 feet, numbering every piece, and she cleared the cradle of timber, and behind the stern section of the skiven, she found the rest of it. There was a small iron strongbox, the kind a ship's master kept in his cabin for the papers and the coin of the voyage, and it was locked, and its lock was rusted solid. There was a leather satchel rotted nearly to pulp, and inside the satchel a packet of papers wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the wet off them, and there was, laid almost with care along the bottom of the cradle, wrapped in what had once been a square of sailcloth, and was now a brown shroud, the long bones of a man. She did not cry out, and she did not run. She had grown up at her father's work, and she had buried him with her own hands when the undertaker's price proved beyond her, and the dead did not frighten her the way they frighten people who have been kept from them. For a long time, she knelt by the bones. Whoever he had been laid out straight and wrapped, and given the only burial his killer could give him, which told her something about the killer she filed away and did not yet understand. Then she covered the bones again with the rotted sailcloth, gently, and she turned to the things that could speak, which were the strongbox and the oilcloth packet of papers. There's a moment in every uncovering when the thing stops being a mystery and starts being a wrong, and a person must decide what she is going to do about it. Tessa Vane knelt in the lamp room of the cheap lighthouse with a dead man wrapped at her side and a locked box she could not open and a packet of papers she had not yet read, and she made the decision then, in the cold, without speaking it aloud. She was not going to put the wall back. Whatever this was, it was going to come out into the light, because that was what a light was for. The papers, when she had carried them down to the keeper's quarters and dried them carefully by the stove and unfolded them where they would not crack, told most of the story. They were in two hands. The first hand was a ship's log, the master's log of the bark Skiven, kept in a small, neat script, and its last entries described a December passage down the coast in worsening weather, with a cargo of $40,000 in coined silver consigned to a banking house in San Francisco, and the master's growing worry as the fog closed in and the leadsman could not find the bottom. And then the entries stopped. The second hand was rougher, and it was not a log but a kind of confession, written years later. And Tessa read it through twice by the stove with the cold coming up through the floor and the lamp burning above her. And when she had finished, she understood the whole shape of it at last. The man who had written the confession was named Cobb. He had been a wrecker on that coast in the bad years, and he had been, by his own account, the man who set the false light. For that was the thing the town had half guessed and never proven. In the years before the lighthouse, when the bar was unmarked, the worst of the wreckers had not waited for ships to come to grief by accident. On nights of fog, they had ridden the point with a lantern on a pole or a fire built where a safe light ought to be. And they had drawn ships onto the bar on purpose, and they had taken the cargoes off the dead. The Skiven had not come onto the bar by the chance of the fog. She had been called onto it by a false light, and her 19 souls had drowned so that a few men could carry $40,000 in silver up off the beach in the dark. The man Cobb had been one of those men, and the confession was the confession of a man near death who could no longer carry it. The part of it that made Tessa set the page down and sit very still was not the wrecking, terrible as that was. It was what had happened after. The silver divided among the wreckers, and the largest share had gone to the man who organized them and owned the boats and the beach, and that man was Halloran. And one of the wreckers, a younger man named Sundberg, who had pulled 4 living souls out of the surf that night and had not understood until too late what the lantern on the point had been for, had threatened to carry the whole thing to the county sheriff. And Halloran had killed him for it, quietly, and the others had helped Halloran hide the body. And Cobb wrote that they had wrapped young Sundberg in sailcloth and never spoken of him again. Years later, when the government surveyed the point for a harbor light, Halloran had used his salvage money and his standing to win the building contract. The wrecker contracted to build the very light that would end the wrecking. And Tessa understood now why he had built it cheap, and why there was a false wall in the lamp room. Halloran had walled into the highest room of his own lighthouse, the stern section of the ship he had murdered, and the strongbox with its papers, and the bones of the man he had killed to keep the secret, because he could not bring himself to destroy them, and he dared not let them be found, and because some men, having done a thing too large to live with, build a monument to it and call the monument something else. The cheap lighthouse was a grave. He had made the whole town live in the shadow of it for 15 years, and laugh at its cheapness and never know what it was. The strongbox she opened on the 8th day, after the papers, with a cold chisel and her father's heaviest hammer and a great deal of patience, working the rusted lock until the bolt sheared. It did not give easily. The box was iron, no larger than a bread loaf, its lid rusted to the body in a single welded seam of corrosion, and she could not pick the lock because the lock was no longer a lock, but a solid lump of oxide. So she did what her father had done with a frozen mill gate, which was to work cold and patient at the hinge pins rather than the lock, soaking the iron with the lamp oil she could ill spare, tapping the chisel along the seam 100 times and 100 more. Never a heavy blow that would crack the contents, only the steady persuasion of a small force applied exactly where the metal was weakest. It took her the better part of a day, and when the bolt finally sheared, the box did not spring open so much as sigh, the lid lifting a half-inch on a breath of the same sealed air. Inside, wrapped in canvas gone green with age, was the ship's manifest of the Skiven under the seal of the consigning house in San Francisco, naming the silver and its owners and its value to the dollar, and a bundle of the coined silver itself, perhaps $200 of it, that Halloran had sealed up with the rest, as if to make the grave complete. The bulk of the silver was long gone, spent and scattered 18 years before, yet the manifest under seal was worth more than the silver ever had been, because the manifest was proof. And the silver in the box tied the proof to the place, and the bones tied the place to the murder, and the confession in Cobb's hand tied all of it to Halloran. She had the whole of it now, and having it, she did the hardest thing, which was nothing, for 3 more days, while she thought through what she would do with it, and how, because she had learned from watching her father that a thing done in haste is a thing done badly, and that she would have only one chance to bring this out in a way that could not be buried again. Halloran, she learned from the old woman in the dunes, was still alive. He was past 70 now, a respected man, a builder and a landowner who lived in a good house up the coast at the county seat and gave money to the church and was spoken of as a pillar. The men who had helped him were mostly dead. Cobb was dead, his confession written and left where it could be found by anyone who opened the wall, which Tessa came to understand had been his own last act of conscience, the placing of the confession in the cradle, a thing he could not say in life and could not take to the grave unsaid. Marta Åkerlund heard all of it on her doorstep with her net across her knees, and when Tessa finished, the old woman wept, not loudly, the way the very old weep, and she said the name Sundberg, and Tessa understood that the old woman had known him. She had known him well. Marta Åkerlund had been Sundberg's aunt. The young man who had pulled 4 souls out of the surf and died for wanting to tell the truth had been her sister's boy, come over from Norway to fish, and he had vanished one night in 1869, and the town had said he had drowned on the bar with the rest, and his mother had died believing her son was somewhere under that gray water. And here was his grave, 18 years sealed in the top of the cheap lighthouse, and here was the proof of who had put him there. This was the moment Tessa might have gone to a sheriff or a judge and put the matter in the hands of the law and let powerful men decide what a dead fisherman and an old woman were owed. She did not. She had no faith that the law, which had entered the silver as lost to the sea and never asked the harder question, would trouble itself now for a Norwegian boy, 18 years dead. What she had faith in was the thing itself, the bones and the manifest, and the confession and the false wall, the evidence that no banker's distance and no respectable subscription to the church could argue away. She did not need to accuse Halloran. She needed only to bring the thing into the light and let it be seen, and let the seeing do the work that no accusation could. So she sent for Benfield, the district official, on the pretext of a problem with the lamp, and she sent word as well, through the storekeeper, to the county recorder and to the editor of the small newspaper at the county seat. that the keeper of the cheap lighthouse had found human remains and ship's papers walled into the tower, and that anyone who wished to see them might come. And then she did the one thing that ensured it could not be quietly handled and buried, which was that she did not wait for them to come to her in secret. She brought the whole of it down the spiral stair, piece by piece over 2 days, and she laid it out in the open base of the tower where the door stood wide to the point, the stern board with its name, the strong box, the manifest under its broken seal, the confession in Cobb's hand, and last and most carefully the bones in their sailcloth, laid on a plank with the dignity that 18 years had denied them. By the time Benfield rode up from Cape Blanco, the town had already come. They came up the rutted half-mile in 2s and 3s, the storekeeper and his wife, the fishermen in their tarred coats, the saloon man wiping his hands on his apron, the old hands who remembered the wrecking years and had spent 18 years not speaking of them. And they stood in the open base of the cheap lighthouse, and they read the name on the stern board, and they looked at the bones, and they did not laugh at the lighthouse anymore. One of the oldest fishermen, a man who had been a boy on that beach in 1869, stood a long time before the stern board and then took off his cap, and one by one the men around him took off theirs, and no one said anything, because there was nothing to say that the laid-out things did not say better. The recorder came, a careful man in a black coat who had ridden down from the county seat, half expecting a keeper's wild story. And he read the manifest under its seal, and turned it over in his hands, and read it again, and grew pale, and asked Tessa in a quiet voice how long the wall had stood, and she told him 18 years, and he set the manifest down very carefully as if it had become heavy. The newspaper editor came and wrote it all down in a small book, and asked to copy the confession word for word, and Tessa let him, because a thing printed could not be unprinted. And Marta Okerlund came up the dune for the first time in years, leaning on a fishing gaff for a staff, and stood over the bones of her sister's son, and put her old hand on the sailcloth, and said his name once, and that was the only accusation anyone needed to hear. Halloran was never tried. He was an old man, and the wheels of the county moved slowly, and before they could move at all, he was found dead in his good house, at the county seat in his bed, with no mark on him, an old man's heart simply stopping in the night. 3 days after the newspaper at the county seat printed the story of what had been found in the tower he built. There are those who said he took his own life, and those who said the truth had simply been more than a 70-year-old heart could carry, and Tessa did not concern herself with which it was. The wrongdoer was not the point. He had built a grave and called it a lighthouse, and made a whole town live in its shadow. And now the grave was open, and the town knew what it was, and the man's dissolution, whatever its cause, was a small thing beside that. What mattered came after, and it came slowly, the way restitution always comes. The county, shamed into it by the newspaper and the manifest under seal, reopened the matter of the skiven, and the consigning house in San Francisco, long since paid out by its insurers, had no further claim, and so the small bundle of recovered silver and the value the county was made to acknowledge were directed, by a recorder who had found his conscience, to the heirs of those who had drowned on the bar in 1869. There were not many heirs to find after 18 years, and the sums were not large, and money does not raise the dead. Marta Okerlund, the last of Sundberg's blood on that coast, was given enough to mend her roof and keep her in firewood for the rest of her days. And more than that, she was given the truth, and the body, and a grave with her sister's boy's name, cut into a real stone above the dunes where the wind off the sea would find it. Tessa buried him herself, or helped to, in the small churchyard above the river mouth, with the town standing by. She had learned, burying her father, how a grave is made, and she lent her hands to the making of this one. And when the stone was set, she stood with the old woman and read the name on it, Anders Sundberg, and the years, and below them the single word that Marta had asked the mason to cut, which was home. The harbor man did not say she should not stay anymore. Benfield, who had told her the cheap lighthouse was a hard post, and she should not expect to last, wrote in his district report that the keeper had discovered the remains and brought them to light, and he recommended that she be confirmed in the post. And she was. She kept the cheap lighthouse for 31 years. She trimmed the lamp every night of those years, and never once let it go dark. And the false wall she did not rebuild. The seaward arc of the lamp room she left open and bare, the brick showing where the plaster had been, and she did not need anyone to ask why. I will tell you the last of it the way she would have wanted it told. Plainly, she did not grow rich, nor did she become famous beyond that stretch of coast, where they stopped calling it the cheap lighthouse within a year, and began, without anyone deciding to, calling it Sundberg's Light. She lived out her life in the 2 damp rooms at the base of the tower with her father's tools oiled and hung on the wall, and the gray sea always at the window. A solitary woman who had wanted only the work and the chance to prove she could do it, and who had found behind a false wall in a cheap tower a wrong 18 years old, and brought it into the light because that was what a light was for. The smell went out of the lamp room within a month of the wall coming down, once the sealed air had cleared and the dead had been given to the earth. Yet Tessa noticed in the years after that on certain still nights past midnight, when the draft came round the open arc where the false wall had been, she would catch for a moment a trace of brine and old timber, faint and clean now, nothing rotten left in it. She did not mind it. She had come to think of it as the building breathing, a thing that had held its breath for 18 years and could let it out at last. Have you ever wondered how many quiet towers and dismissed places are still holding their breath, waiting for the one pair of hands patient enough to feel for the catch in the wall? If a story like this one stays with you, there are others like it. The last image is a small one, and it is the one she carried. Late on a clear night in her old age, she climbed the spiral stair she had climbed 10,000 times, and she lit the lamp, and she stood in the small iron room at the top with the beam swinging out 30 miles over the black water, and she laid her hand flat against the bare brick of the seaward arc where the false wall had been, the way her father had taught her to lay a hand flat to a wheel and listen. There was no catch in it now. There was only the brick, and the cold, clean air off the sea, and the steady turning of the light she had never once let fail.